Walden's a big book, and, well, you knew this would happen. We can't spend as much time on every chapter as we did on the first couple. But I do, or the first one, but I do want to spend some time highlighting some things in some of the other chapters that have really drawn people's attention in the past. The three chapters I want to pull together, especially, are Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Reading, and Higher Laws. One of the things that you see, especially in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, is his extensive use of metaphor. And other, just all kinds of them, tons of them. He's constantly making comparisons with this and that and the other. But the pond, obviously, is the central metaphor. And especially in the chapter on ponds. Think about all the things that water stands for. Water is a metaphor for time. Like the flowing of a stream, right? The passing of time. Water is a metaphor for purification, sanctification, baptism, and Christianity is not the only religion that sees water that way. Hinduism, for example, bathing, purification, cleansing, Judaism, Islam, all of the major religions actually look at water as being a cleansing, purifying thing, not simply physically, but also spiritually. It's an opportunity to renew, to be reborn, to be regenerated. When you think of baptism, it's a rising again with a new life, born again, for example. And so he takes a lot of time in this chapter, particularly talking about the pond, his surroundings physically, but he's not. Notice how he oscillates between sort of physical descriptions and then philosophical and metaphysical observation. He loves to do that. He's doing it purposefully. He's not just doing this kind of. He's not just drifting off into some sort of philosophical reverie. When he starts talking about the pond, or he starts talking about a tree, or he starts talking about a fight between ants, which is very famous in the text, or he starts talking about squirrels. At first you say, well, he started talking about the squirrel, and he was describing the squirrel, and all of a sudden he starts making this point about life and the universe and all these really deep things, these philosophical things. Yeah, that's the point. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to connect the natural world with the spiritual, because he thinks that we as creatures are uniquely positioned to do that, because we are both physical and spiritual in nature. It comes together in us. And so metaphor is the vehicle for expressing that nexus between the physical and the spiritual. So that's really important. He's not getting off topic when he starts describing the pond and then he starts waxing philosophical. By the way, some people really hate philosophy. They really don't like it. Thoreau knows that. And he knows that there are some people who really they're very practically minded, and they're actually, frankly, rather threatened by philosophy. You ever had one of those 2 a.m. discussions, you and your friends sitting around, hopefully sober, and you start talking about deep things, very deep things. There's something about being up late at night. Our defenses are down. We're not trying to be the fake, phony selves that we sometimes are. And we actually ask and think about deeper questions in the still quiet of the night after you've been up a little bit and you're a little bit punchy or what have you, and you and your friends are sitting around and talking about really deep, meaningful thoughts and deep, meaningful things like what's truth and what's happiness and all these things and what is reality and all these wonderful questions that people who are of a philosophical bent always want to explore. But there's always somebody who stands up in the middle of the whole conversation after it's been going on for an hour and decides he or she has had enough. This is all BS, right? And they storm out of the room. Philosophy, this is all just a bunch of garbage or BS or what have you. That always happens, doesn't it? There's always one guy who does. You know what that is, according to Thoreau? That's being scared. That person is fearful. They're afraid of asking deep questions because they're scared of what the answers will be. Those types of people who never want to pursue it, who blow it off, and who say, come on now, bring this back down to practical reality. You know why? Because they're frightened rabbits. They don't like where the conversation's going. They don't feel comfortable talking about deep and meaningful things because they have nothing to add. And because of that, their lives are empty. They're scared. They're scared of looking into the abyss. And so when he's using metaphor, he's doing that. He's constantly saying, I'm not going to be satisfied with just looking at reality as material. I'm going to look at reality as being this intersection of spirit and nature. He also explores in here lots of really great stuff about time and space. He's very curious about the relationship between time and space. For a 19th century guy, not exposed to 20th century physics, this is pretty deep stuff. He's on to something. When he looks at, on page 87, for example, he says, both place and time were changed, and I dwelt nearer to those parts of the universe and to those eras in history which had most attracted me. He said, being out in the woods by myself, I had no idea that it was 1837 or 1847 or 1845 or whatever year it was. I didn't know. You know, what was happening to me on that day happened to people 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Time seemed to sort of fade away or vanish. And so when I was living the way I was living like people had always lived. And I had a connection. Time sort of stood still or erased itself in a way. Both time and place changed. My experience helped me transcend time and better connect with those coming after me and coming before me. On page 97, for example, he talks a little bit about this, and he says, all these times and places and occasions are now and here. God himself culminates in the present moment and will never be more divine in the lapse of all ages. If you're looking to connect with God, says Thoreau, do not wait. He's right here, right now, and he won't be more divine later, and he wasn't more divine in the past. He is what he is. It echoes in a way kind of reminiscent of the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow in Christian scripture. It's really interesting here. He's co-opting this to some extent, yes. And we are enabled to apprehend at all what is sublime and noble only by the perpetual instilling and drenching of the reality which surrounds us. You only know what you know right now. It's what's real. What's real is right now. It's all you have. Yesterday's gone, tomorrow isn't here. What you have is right now. The immediacy of the experience is what he's trying to capture here. Stop putting everything off. Deal with the question of what is life and why am I here now, not later, not when you get to be old. I mean, he says at one point in Walden, he says, I didn't want to wait until I got old and I was dying, and that's when I sort of raise myself up on my deathbed and say, oh, I never really understood why I was here. I didn't want to get to the end of life and realize I'd never really lived. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do it now. You know, of course, in the back of your mind should be the fact that this guy's got a terminal illness, okay? So immediacy, very, very important to him. On page 98, for example, he deals with this question of time again. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I would drink deep, fish in the sky whose bottom is pebbly with stars. This is a fantastic metaphor. It's really beautiful. Think how deep this metaphor is. It works on many different levels. Think about a river or a stream. The water as it moves by is never the same, is it? It's always different molecules of water, right? And the stream today is different from the stream tomorrow, is different from the stream 1 second from now. If you're looking at one fixed spot on the bottom of the stream that you see down to the bottom of the stream, and you see the pebbles and you see the physical surrounding, it's the movement of the water, okay? And yet it has an identity, doesn't it? It has its own identity. It's never the same creature, it's never the same phenomenon, but it kind of is, isn't it? It's a process. A stream is actually a process. It's not a thing. It's a process of water molecules moving in a particular direction. The thing around, over, above, under the stream, the setting, is fixed. But time is the stream I go a-fishing in. It's always changing, but yet there's eternality behind, around. It's a fabulous metaphor. It is really significant and profound when you think it through. It works on so many wonderful levels. He is really interested in these deep questions. And what does he do? He turns to nature, natural objects, to inspire him to think about it, because he, like Emerson, believes deeply That's what nature's here for. We just haven't been reading the signs, you see? Simplicity for him, where he says simplicity, simplicity, simplicity on page 91. And then later he even simplifies the phrase and says simplify, simplify. He simplifies his own phrase about simplicity. Simplicity to him is clarity. The more you simplify, the easier it is to see eternal truth. Get these things out of your life and you'll see what is important to you. People after natural disasters will tell you once their house has been destroyed, you know, it was a terrible thing that happened to me, but I had to go back to the most basic things. What were the most important things to me? My family, my spouse or significant other, my church, the people that I love. That's what's real. The house was a thing. And these people who go through great adversity understand that. Clarity is what happens after disaster sometimes. Sad as it is, it does bring enlightenment. In reading, he talks about books and nature, and one thing to understand, he doesn't see the antagonism between books and nature that Emerson sees. I think this is to his credit. To Emerson, nature is the great text, and that man's texts are inferior to nature. They're just kind of some sort of thing that we do to occupy our time, but the really important text is nature. And what we do when we write a book is some sort of cheap imitation of what nature's doing. It's inferior somehow. Thoreau actually has this wonderful, brilliant insight. No, man's texts are not inferior to the text of nature. Man's texts are what people do. It's what we leave behind. Trees have leaves that they drop. Rabbits, he talks about the little rabbit episode where he's tracking rabbits. Rabbits leave tracks, people leave books. It's what we do. And no one would look at leaves on a tree that have fallen and say, that's not nature, it's artificial, and it's inferior. No one would look at the tracks that a rabbit leaves and says, that's not nature, that's artificial. Why would we look at human communication, be it in books or orally, or one would even say video or audio? Why would we say that that's not nature? Thoreau really believes that everything we do is part of nature. Everything we do is a natural thing. And so they're not inferior to nature, they participate in nature. It's a really wonderful, sophisticated redefinition of reading and its importance, and I think he outdoes Emerson on this point. Now, if you look in Higher Laws, he has a couple of things there as well. This is the point at which he really wants to bring together sort of the living in the natural world as a spiritual being thing, this praxis of spirit and matter, this intersection, this nexus between that. Because that's, when you think about who you are as yourself, okay, both body and spirit, you are a little microcosmic embodiment of the universe, because you contain both spirit and matter. And he says that's there for a reason. We shouldn't ignore the body. We shouldn't do what Paul or others say, and that is we're spirit and there's this shell that we're stuck or trapped in. So he's trying to come to terms with the fact that he is both spirit and matter, soul and animal. And where he does this most poignantly, I think, is with food. On page 214 of the Princeton edition, you'll see he kind of struggles with this question of being a vegetarian. He seems to say that, eating flesh seems kind of unclean. He says there's something essentially unclean about this diet and all the flesh and stuff. He kind of doesn't like it. It's messy, it's troublesome, it's gross. Eating flesh is kind of gross, he says. He says, I'm less and less inclined to fish these days. There is unquestionably this instinct in me which belongs to the lower order of creation, though. Yet with every year I am less a fisherman. So he says, it's not as though I don't eat flesh, and I'm not completely a vegetarian, but the older I get, the more vegetarian I get, because I become a little bit more repulsed by that aspect of it. And yet I do. Yet I do want to eat flesh, because on page 219 he says, we are conscious of an animal in us, which awakens in proportion as our higher nature slumbers. It is reptile and sensual, and perhaps cannot be wholly expelled, like the worms which even in life and health occupy our bodies. Possibly we may withdraw from it, but never change its nature. So, on the one hand, he sympathizes with Paul and says, I'm kind of repulsed by my body and its functions, and I'm kind of repulsed by this whole idea of eating food and defecating and all the other junk that's gross about us, snot and everything else that we do. And that's the spirit in us, basically sort of saying there's something higher than matter. That's what it's telling us when we're repulsed by flesh, when we're repulsed by matter, is that there's something higher in us that says, don't dwell in it, don't stay in it. There's something more in the universe than just that stuff, that junk that comes out of you or whatever, okay, or that you put into yourself. But on the other hand, we're not to reject entirely our physicality because we're here in this flesh for a reason, according to Thoreau. We can't completely detach ourselves from it. There's no point in trying. And yet, the more enlightened I become, the more I become aware of how inferior matter is to spirit, even though I can't disconnect entirely. One of the things we talked about early on was the structure of Walden. Did you notice, as you read through it, that it follows the pattern of a single year? It goes from summer to summer, and in the middle is winter, and we go through all the seasons in Walden. Now, he lived there 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, but he structures Walden like it's a whole year, a single year, so that you see the change in the pond throughout the year. The pond is like a character in the piece. And you get to see how it changes, how it is clothed, how it is housed, right? How it's kept warm or cold, right? And what fuels it. And so the pond is like a person in a way. And it goes through the year the way a person goes through the year, the way the animals go through the year, the way vegetation goes through the year. And so he wants to show you the cycle of the year, just like we have cycles in lives, just like we have cycles in institutions, that they go through cycles. And in the back of your mind ought to be, hey, economic cycles as well, because that's kind of one of the things that kicked this off. Walden's a big book, and, well,